Every year, the victims of white-collar crimes lose anywhere from $300 to $800 billion. This number is staggeringly higher than street-level offenses that amount to only about $16 billion a year, according to the FBI. If you're unfamiliar with what exactly white-collar crime means, it's an umbrella term for financially motivated crimes, including money laundering and wire, securities, and tax fraud, among several other offenses. The term was first coined in 1939 by sociologist Edwin Sutherland.
He came to the conclusion that everybody in the world of criminology was getting it wrong. In other words, they had a theory that crime was closely correlated with poverty or sociopathy.
That's Jennifer Taub, an expert on white-collar crime and a professor of law at the Western New England University School of Law. She's also the author of Big Dirty Money, The Shocking Injustice and Unseen Cost of White-Collar Crime. Taub says Sutherland was a visionary who called out the elitist class.
He was looking largely at corporate crime, things like antitrust violations, the big trust-busting cases. He was also looking at things like industrial accidents or union busting. So the focus for him initially on white-collar crime were these very big crimes committed by the most powerful.
However, after Sutherland's unexpected death in 1950, this newfound category of white-collar crime shifted to include a broader range of violations.
Instead of focusing on the status of the person committing a crime to show that even the wealthy can cause harm and victimize others, the shift became for prosecutors and sociologists to begin to focus instead on the nature of the offense, to think of it as white-collar crime as opposed to a certain type of offender. And so what we had developed over time were the kinds of offenses, things like money laundering or wire fraud or mail fraud, securities fraud, things like that.
Taub argues that this hazy distinction of what falls under white-collar crime muddles the pond and helps the largest, most powerful offenders get away.
Due to the fact that experts began to look at white-collar crime as about the nature of the offense instead of the status of the offender, it became true that there was now blue-collar, white-collar crime. And in other words, now when the FBI collects data, it's incomplete on crime nationwide, things like writing a bad check or welfare fraud is counted up as white-collar crime alongside things like, mail fraud and wire fraud and money laundering. And so there's just kind of this mixture of different types of offenders mixed in simply because they committed some kind of economic crime. So we don't really have a good picture of whether the big white-collar crimes are on the rise or we're just talking about small ante stuff.
Despite the massive economic burden of fraud and corruption cases, we rarely hear about it in the daily news. And while there's a federal national database for criminal offenders, nothing similar exists yet when it comes to white-collar offenders, leading to a lack of transparency and coverage.
The kind of data that we do have, the best comes from the U.S. attorneys in their 93 jurisdictions where they put a report out every year of all the cases they're bringing. But that's kind of later down the line. If a case is already being prosecuted or considered for prosecution, that's long after the person committed the offense or it was investigated by a regulatory agency and so on. So we do have, I think part of it is maybe no one has ever asked the question. And, there's this expression from business, which is you can't manage what you don't measure. And I don't think that the powers that be really want to spend a lot of time trying to manage white-collar crime. They'd rather pretend it doesn't exist.
The Bureau of Justice Statistics states that there is no unanimous consensus on how to define these illegal acts, raising another hurdle for tracking these cases. The organization's own definition loosely states it to be any violation of the law through nonviolent means committed by a person or organization for individual or corporate benefit. But often, it's not until this corruption reaches monumental heights that it begins to unravel. One huge corporate fraud in recent history was the collapse of the energy and commodities company Enron in late 2001. 1 year prior, in 2000, it claimed revenues of more than $100 billion, an inflated figure that in reality was the culmination of years of accounting fraud and conspiracy.
When it was a priority in 2002 to hold those who were committing accounting fraud accountable, it was done. A task force was put together, and it was successful. They were successful in prosecuting and convicting numerous people who were at the highest level, CEOs and CFOs, involved in accounting fraud. So we have seen it work, but it's only going to work if it is actually a priority. And, the numbers truly tell the story. Between July of 2002 and March of 2006, the Department of Justice convicted more than 82 CEOs, 85 corporate presidents, 36 chief financial officers, and 14 chief operating officers, all involved in corporate fraud cases.
But these days, the number of prosecutions in these cases has plummeted. White-collar criminals rarely face jail time, and the cases are extremely difficult to prosecute in front of a jury. Pro-business lobbyists, coupled with looser corporate laws, are just a few of the enablers that feed into this epidemic. As another example, Taub highlights that in February of this year, President Donald Trump pardoned multiple people that had been found guilty of these crimes.
The types of offenses there were bribery, investment fraud, tax evasion, Medicare fraud, public corruption, an extortion cover-up, money laundering, conspiracy to defraud the federal government, obstruction of justice, mail fraud, and wire fraud. And in the official White House announcement about these pardons and commutations of sentences, the announcement actually used the word successful 4 times to describe these elite outlaws, but made no mention of any of the people they had victimized.
One of these pardons included Paul Pogue, a construction businessman who pled guilty to underpaying his taxes by $473,000. Another pardon was for financier Michael Milken, who was indicted on 6 felony counts in 1989 for conspiracy, filing false reports with the SEC, and securities, mail, and tax fraud. Milken helped build a lucrative market for risky high-yield securities, referred to as junk bonds. He was initially sentenced to 10 years in a minimum security prison, but only served 2 years of that time. Today, this cycle of corruption and fraud continues as powerful lawyers and influential connections protect them and feed into this system of inequality, leaving the American people to pick up the tab. The 2008 stock market crash is a prime example. The housing bubble, propped up on extremely risky mortgages, caused millions to lose their homes and jobs, while the bankers at big lending companies enabling the situation got off scot-free. In the end, just one Wall Street executive went to jail for 30 months for his role in the financial crisis.
Lanny Brewer, who headed up the criminal division at the Department of Justice, was facing a lot of heat, and he was interviewed on Frontline on television, and the host asked him why the Justice Department hadn't gone after any Wall Street bankers. And he claimed that he couldn't bring the case unless he could prove beyond a reasonable doubt that these bankers, that people who were defrauded by these bankers, the lies they told about the toxic mortgage-backed securities, he said they had to prove that the other side, meaning investors and so on, had relied on these lies. And when he said that on national television, my hair was on fire because that's not an element that the government has to prove.
Obviously, proving intent is harder in a white-collar criminal case. It's much easier to prove a guilty verdict in a store robbery or bank break-in because there's clear intent.
There's a fear that it will be hard to convince a jury that someone intended to make a false statement and lie to people, that someone intended to cheat on their taxes. It's muddy And unfortunately, the fear of not being able to convince the jury does prevent some prosecutors from bringing the cases forward. You don't often find a smoking gun email. What you really do need to prosecute these cases is to flip the people below, to get them to turn on their bosses.
However, Taub says that this method of thorough investigation was recently deemed to be unimportant by the current Justice Department. As laws around corruption and fraud ease, she points out that these crimes are flourishing under the radar. It's up to the American people to call on politicians and prosecutors to go after everyone that breaks the law, no matter who they are. To find out more about this topic and our guest, Jennifer Taub, visit viewpointsradio.org. Her book, Big Dirty Money, The Shocking Injustice and Unseen Cost of White-Collar Crime, is available online now. This segment was written and produced by Amira Zaveri. Studio production by Jason Dickey. I'm Marty Peterson.
Viewpoints returns in just a moment.
As many as 89% of hospitalized COVID-19 patients are at risk of a complication called cytokine storm, a leading cause of COVID death. But there's good news. Hospitals across the U.S. are enrolling patients in a trial evaluating lemzilumab, a treatment candidate designed specifically to stop this storm, even with only 1 day of treatment. Dr. Cameron Durant, CEO of Humanigen, the company developing lemzilumab.
Having a therapeutic that can significantly reduce the time to recovery from COVID-19 and send patients home earlier could dramatically impact the arc of this pandemic.
Participating in the study means access to a potential treatment option in addition to standard of care therapies. Trial participant Mark Baranski shares his experience.
I don't know if I received lemzilumab or not, but I viewed the trial as doing everything I could for my recovery while contributing to the fight against COVID-19. I certainly encourage others to do the same.
To learn more and find this trial near you, visit StopStorm.com. That's StopStorm.com.
And that's Viewpoints for this week. Viewpoints is a production of MediaTrax Communications. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram to learn more about upcoming shows and find a library of past programs on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, and Spotify. Plus, you'll always find previous segments and more information about our guests at viewpointsradio.org. Join us again next week for another edition of Viewpoints. Coming up next week.
There's things like candy chutes where you can, send the candy down to the end of the driveway.
What are your Halloween plans this year? Then,
we have some people who come in and plan when they're 30. And we have some people who come in and plan when they're 55 and thinking about retirement. And then I have some ladies who come in at 85 and say, we think we ought to start thinking about it.
Understanding a process that we all one day will face. I'm Marty Peterson.
And I'm Gary Price. These stories in depth on your public affairs magazine, Viewpoints.